And back now with syndicated columnist Kathleen Parker and Michael Fletcher, who covers the White House for the Washington Post. Well, we wound up that discussion with John Boehner talking about Rush Limbaugh, so let's continue the talk. Mr. Boehner didn't seem to want to touch that.
Yeah, Republicans have learned to keep their mouths shut when it comes to Rush. Otherwise, they might have to apologize to him. But the interesting thing about this is the whole idea that the White House would engage a talk radio host seems fairly unpresidential. I mean, George W. Bush wouldn't even acknowledge other heads of state. But here we are talking about a radio host. Now, there is my first impulse when I heard about it was, oh, well, there goes the fairness doctrine, because we're having too much fun. Who would want to bring it back? But there's a new little conspiracy theory floating out there that I'll just throw on the table, and that is that the White House is very strategically doing this, because then once you designate Rush Limbaugh as the head of the Republican Party, then you can say, hey, wait a minute, the head of the Republican Party is on the radio every day speaking to 20 million people, more than even the president reaches. Therefore, we need the fairness doctrine. So we'll see.
The fairness doctrine, of course, is the law that we used to have that said if you put on one side, you have to put on the other.
Right.
Now people would argue, of course, broadcasters argue, there are so many places to express opinion on all sides that you don't need that
well,
anymore.
and the president has said he has no interest in that. But Democrats do want to get the fairness doctrine back in place, and Republicans do feel that, and that they think now. This is a new theory, so I won't go too far with it, but there is some chatter that this is actually a deliberate attempt to sort of create this this dynamic that now has to be addressed.
One thing about it, the White House is not reluctant. Mr. Boehner may be reluctant to talk about Rush Limbaugh, but the White House is not.
Not at all. I think
we saw all last week.
I think they found their Michael Moore. I mean, on the other side. I mean, Rush Limbaugh is kind of this polarizing figure, and I think the White House wants to put him out there as kind of the face of the Republican Party because of that. Even though he's very popular with the base, the Republican parties, I think people now, 28% of Americans self-identify as Republican. So their growth is going to come with independence or, bringing back the Reagan Democrats. And as long as Rush Limbaugh is the face of the Republican Party in the White House's view, they won't be able to do that.
Michael, how do people at the White House feel about this idea that suddenly the opposition to the president's budget, a lot of it is coming from very influential Democrats like Max Baucus, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, who says he doesn't see why you should reduce that deduction that upper income people can take on charitable contributions to finance health care. He said he doesn't see any connection between the two. Is the White House going to back off on that, do you think?
They may. I mean, this is a big problem for the White House going forward. If they can't even keep their partisans on board on a proposal like that, and you think about some of the ambitious plans laid out in the budget, you get beyond that into this whole idea of taxing carbon emissions. And a lot of people say that will raise people's energy bills, and the White House acknowledges as much. And they say, well, people will be returned the money through the tax code. It gets to be a very complicated argument. So if you can't keep people on board on something that, the president talked during the campaign about, the wealthy having to kick in more. But if you can't keep Democrats on board, there has to be a concern to them. So
where do you think this is going, Kathleen?
Well, I think, look, the president has come out with a budget that's got everything in it. Clearly, they expect to have to make some compromises along the way. But even if you get a percentage of huge, you still wind up with big. And so these are the sorts of things that they may be willing. I think just listening to Mr. Orzag, there are intimations that these are the kind of things that, well, we could talk about that, So I think what we're looking at right now is not what we're going to end up with. There's a lot of room for new ideas.
What about it's interesting to me in that the president is more popular than ever, according to the latest polls, and yet you're seeing some, question about his policies, and is this budget a good idea? I mean, where do you think this is going to play out here, Mike?
I think a lot of anxiety, obviously, spins off of the economic anxiety people feel. They see the president doing all of these things, even before he was in office. They saw the Bush administration shoveling all of this money into the financial system. And many people say that TARP, the first half of the bailout, basically prevented an implosion, but people have not seen improvement. So I think as long as that overlays there, as long as you have the kind of numbers we saw last week, where unemployment continues to skyrocket, consumer spending continues to tank, I think you'll see this kind of air of anxiety. I think people are hopeful that this stuff will work, but there's no evidence yet that it is working, I think, and people are worried about that.
Well, they're worried, but polls also show that the people are much more patient and with this is huge, and they understand it's complicated. And President Obama's been in place, what, 6 weeks? And so while we in Washington are ready to sort of measure everything on a daily basis, I think if you go out into the hustings, you find that people are much less likely to demand answers immediately. Even President Obama said, look, the economy is not a speedboat, it's an ocean liner. You know, what we're trying to do is change the direction, and whatever changes we have will be gradual. It'll be later down the road that we are in a different place. Of course, we're trying to not free associate to the Titanic, but.
Well, I want to thank all of you, but I tell you, I'm reminded of what Russell Long, the former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, once said, that nobody likes taxes. He used to say, people would tell him, don't tax him, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. And that is more true as every passing day passes.